Hey there, folks. This is Kross coming at you. I just want to give you a little heads up about this episode. We recorded this one back in 2021, late 2021, basically 2022, for patrons as a part of a show that we were doing at the time called PJ's Symposium of Media and Whimsy. You'll hear more about that right away in the intro. But we're just releasing this episode so that you can get a taste of the whole series, which is available on the Patreon. And in addition to Fill This Time, where PJ is out on honeymoon. So again, we're going to take just a couple of week break. I want to say it's like 2.5 or so. I'll keep you posted over the next couple of episodes that we put out here. But enjoy our episode on Chernobyl.
Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to PJ's Symposium of Media and Whimsy, a wonderful show where I get to drag Crossland through shit rather than the other way around. I am one of your hosts, PJ.
I am needless shit dragger Crossland.
Good morning, this is Tim or Tolson. I'm happy to peruse your wares on this podcast.
Wonderful. Today's episode is a lot of media and a lot less whimsy. We are talking about Chernobyl, and this is going to be slightly different than the way we've set up our previous episodes. This is going to be more of a series, so we're doing short form episodes for each of the episodes of HBO's miniseries Chernobyl. So we've got three of us. Tim, you are going to try to make it to as many as you can. I'm not going to commit you to all of them if you don't want to.
I've committed Tim to all of them.
Okay, so we'll have the three of us. Normally it's just Crossland and I, but I'm really excited to have the trio together. But before we start everything else, let's get some cocktail cock. Today, by the way, is kind of a brunch episode. We were recording before noon. So, Crossland, what are you drinking?
I am having a mimosa, so literally orange juice and champagne. I actually did put a drop of grapefruit bitters in just to give it a little bit of a variety because of the champagne that I was using. Just wanted to add a little bit of flavor. So, 2 drops of grapefruit bitters per serving, basically. But yeah, that's it.
Sounds good.
Easy peasy.
Good deal. Tolson, are you drinking anything at the moment?
I am drinking a very savory Pamplemousse LaCroix.
There you go.
I didn't know brunch. Okay, so I went to Ginkgo, which is a coffee shop near me, and I got a cafe mocha and a breakfast burrito, but I ate both of those before going on the podcast. So, yeah.
Nice.
Didn't plan for drinks.
There we go. All good. I don't know what to call it, kind of a kiwi lime mimosa. Found sort of an outline for the recipe online. Didn't look at what it was called and just kind of ran with it. But the fruit of 1 kiwi, the juice of 1 lime, all blended together, vodka, simple syrup, and then that gets shaken, and then I topped it all off with some rosé champagne. So, nice, sweet, fruity. Before we get started, do you guys have anything to say, or are we just going to jump right into the show?
You know, I think in general, maybe it's fun to tee this up. Tim and I watched these as they came out weekly, and pitch black, absolute silence, great experience. But we were watching the show kind of as it rolled out, and we both were immediately obsessed.
I was too. You guys, I think you guys watched them together, right?
Yes, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was separate, but I was also watching them basically at the exact same time. So
I think what's interesting at the time, we had this really cool neighbor that would always come over and watch media with us. He works in the electrical industry, and so kind of didn't want to see the show because of, some of the types of feelings it gives about nuclear energy. But we did bring him in eventually, and I think he caught up and then watched 3 through 6 with us. Mm-hmm. And I think he really enjoyed the series as well, despite some of the challenges. I actually, my thing, I watched episode 1 and 2 last night, but previously, the last time I watched them, the day that I was waiting to hear if I bought my house or not, I was trying to focus on not the fact that I might buy a house and spend a lot of money. So I, in our house in Maple Grove, watched episode 1, and I'm like, this is going to be a de-stressor. Going to this episode, I had what is the closest thing I've ever had to a panic attack when I watched episode 1. The moment that, we're going to get into it, but when Legasov hangs himself, oh my God, I had to shut off my TV and I was hyperventilating. It was so bad. No. And that's the last time I've watched Chernobyl.
All right. Well, I'm glad we get to see it with a little bit of a fresher perspective than that. Everything about this show is intense, and that's one of the things I really, really love about it. But we'll talk about it as they come through. We're going to kind of go through the sort of summary, the plot of each episode, and just kind of interject whatever, whenever. We've got, I don't know if you guys listen to it, but I've been listening to the companion podcast alongside each episode. So I've got some behind the scenes stuff that I've written in there, and we'll just go through it. So without further ado, let's get this started. We begin with, as Tim just mentioned, kind of the end of life for Valery Legasov, who, this is 2 years to the day after the explosion at Chernobyl. I think it's the exact second that he hangs himself, which isn't known for sure, but narratively that makes sense. And he is at the intro of the show recording sort of his account of the aftermath of the sort of justice system and how that played out. And the theme of the show that really begins here is the cost of lies and what that cost truly is. And he's got a cat that he's like feeding and giving a whole bunch of extra food to. But he takes this box of cassettes that he's recording and hides them outside for somebody to find before eventually killing himself and starting this whole really dark, gritty series that we got before us. So obviously, Tolson, you had a pretty visceral reaction last time you watched it, but how did it come across this time?
Well, so what's interesting too is since that moment, or buying my house, whatever, I actually have read the entire transcript, which is not exactly what, it's not in English, but I read an English translation, so it's not the same thing. So it was interesting this time when I watched it to watch him, hit play and then think about how I read it, a couple of years ago. But yeah, once again, it's kind of like, really starting off strong on the dread.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's interesting, and I think Craig goes into this in the podcast too. And I've got some background from Script Notes, of which is the other podcast that he is a big part of with John August. Some like production-y things, but I love the attention to detail and the way that like he kind of gets roped into this whole thing, and the way that this starts off in a complete like counter narrative with the idea of here's your main character and here he is dead. Like it, and it's like, how do we get to this point? And he's kind of recounting this diary, and it's a brilliant kind of strike, and it's also, what pulled Craig into writing the series in the first place, or one of the many things. But yeah.
You also get the beginnings of what becomes really, really good audio design throughout this entire show, and that's sparse. There's very little overlay music, and when it's there, it's, I don't know. It's not.
It's meant to sit with you, not to like lead you like a lot of soundtracks do.
Yeah.
It's meant to be like there with you so that you kind of. It's not building your anticipation or like da-dum to like build you up into the action. It's there to kind of just sit and resonate. And I think that's so great because we're dealing with radiation, we're dealing with an invisible force, and the music itself is even kind of that same sort of industrial invisible force, which is fun.
After this moment, we jump to 2 years earlier, the date of the explosion, and we're within the...
We start in the apartment.
Yeah, we start in the apartment.
Right. Yeah. This is a real family with a real story. Craig mentions that he tried to follow as closely to reality as possible, which is incredible. I know... oh, God, what's her name?
We talking about the actress or are we talking about the character?
Yeah, no, the character. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but
I know that I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but her husband's name is Vasily Inertenko.
That sounds right.
Yeah. But she has spoken out a lot about this and has talked extensively. I don't believe she's alive anymore, as far as I remember. But
Ludmila, by the way, Ludmila.
Yep, Ludmila. But approaching it with the knowledge that it's real, as opposed to just kind of a narrative device to show what's going on, and the sort of amalgamation of the lives of these firefighters, hit me a lot harder, which was really interesting. But he's in the fire brigade that's called out, and there's a beam of light in the distance coming from the reactor, which is terrifying but also gorgeous. And they're really dismissive about it. Like, it's a roof fire, it's going to burn all night. Like, we're whatever.
I would say
it's
I
going to
don't
be
know
late
if they're
night.
dismissive because they are unaware of the gravity of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Dismissive of the
Imminent threat.
We
Right,
as observers notice that and say it's dismissive, but in fact, like, they had no idea what they were walking into. Otherwise, I'm sure they wouldn't have. You know, it's the same reason that the guy picks up the graphite and, like, his hands, he doesn't know what the fuck they're doing. He just assumes they're putting out a fire. Like,
That's true.
to your point, real quickly on dramatization, there's a quote that Craig has repeated a lot. When you're dealing with something this inherently dramatic, there's only danger in adding your own drama on top of it, because you're diminishing the truth, which is shocking in and of itself. I think that's why this thing resonates so clearly, is because so many of these stories are just straight up true, pulled out, extracted as directly as possible, and the truth is horrifying in this circumstance.
Yeah. I meant to say this in the intro, but I obviously have a physics degree, but I didn't study nuclear physics all that much, so I'm approaching it with maybe a modicum of knowledge on the physics side of things, but that doesn't really matter that much, you know?
Yeah.
Like this whole story, it does a good job of explaining any of the physics aspects, and you don't need any sort of external knowledge to really understand it. I just wanted to add that in there. I meant to say that at the beginning, but forgot. So
I would say I'm not going to try to split hairs throughout this series of episodes, but I would say the only problems I have with the show are the science. I don't know very much about nuclear physics, but there are some pretty egregious mistakes that I think one of them we talk about in episode 2. But it does a good job of presenting the spirit of what was going on, and some of the disinformation that people say about their understanding of nuclear physics, especially in the hospital later, is bad, but that's acceptable because they didn't know. The perspective of the character doesn't. But then there's a couple things later that do bug me a bit, but it captures the raw emotion better than it captures the science.
right.
Yeah, it's more intended to bring it down to layman's terms as close as possible. And like you said, obviously there are misconceptions. One of the things, and PJ, of course, you listening to the podcast too, one of the things that Craig says often is like, this is the first disaster with nuclear weapons, and so they didn't know what the hell was going on. No one had been educated. That's
Weapons?
It's not the first. 3 Mile Island happened before this.
Well, that's all that I'm saying is that's what Craig said. This was the first disaster of this level, right?
Okay.
And I've been to 3 Mile Island. It's really interesting.
Let's jump into the control room where we next find ourselves with a host of characters, some very loudmouthed and some very timid. Dyatlov being obviously the loudmouth, brash. I wouldn't say ignorant, but bullheaded. And for good reason. We learn later on that his promotion was entirely dependent on this test going well. And that's all he seemed to care about. And corners are being cut left and right. And we get some sub-dialogue between some of the operators. One says we did nothing wrong, and the other says, but we did, and leaves it at that. So we know something maybe in the background went off, but they were following protocol and something happened. I loved this scene. This jumping into this old Soviet control room in a nuclear plant, which apparently is a button for button remake of the control rooms. That's the other thing that I really like about the show, is how true to the architecture and design and building of everything that went into this. It was really impressive.
If you are a fan of brutalist architecture, the vistas in this rival just about any other media. And I do like that. I would say, when we talked earlier about like capturing the emotion and the drama, one thing that I thought was interesting seeing the control room this time was, what is interesting is that this is a remarkable period piece. And I kind of wish I could spend time, not even surrounding the disaster, but just in like a whole series or, you know, multiple season thing of the drama of what's going on in various parts of Soviet Russia in the 1980s. Like the spirit and emotion of it is phenomenal. You forget that these people are speaking with English accents because of how well everything is constructed.
Yeah, the production design is immaculate, and it feeds into exactly what you're talking about. You feel the energy of Soviet Russia, specifically because, I mean, despite like the British accents and whatnot, like it just dissolves away in the background. And I think that really it's a combination of the production design and like Johan Rank's shots and direction here that are like unmistakably incredible.
Craig Mazin touches on this in that podcast quite a bit, but I think it's important to note here, like, all of the accents of the characters are basically their natural speaking accents, more or less, which I think he does it intentionally, but it really shows, it allows the actors to truly convey the emotion that the characters should be feeling in the moment and really get across the feel as opposed to the true to form. It's easy to make a Russian accent sound like a cartoon.
It would have been terrible. Like, with the exception of, and I think we meet him in episode 2, with the exception of Stellan Skarsgård, who has more of an actual like Swedish accent. It's not really a Russian accent. If people tried to do Russian accents, it would have been terrible.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think all the acting choices are incredible, and the decision to put it in kind of the natural language of each of these characters was much better than trying to force like a outline or rigid structure around how they were going to speak.
To your point, though, Tim, I would love to see a follow-up series. And I mean, I was joking around with it, just kind of in my head, calling it Chernobyl 2, but the fall of the Soviet Union, which a lot of people contribute to the Chernobyl disaster as the catalyst that brought it down. I would love to see that in this style, in the same sort of following, even the same characters, the same actors. I would love to see that. And maybe not the same actors, because it's probably not going to follow the same people. But I felt like Gorbachev he's not in this episode, is he?
No, he's
second episode.
He's in the second episode. But I felt like everybody did such a great job with this piece that all I want is more. Let's move forward a little bit.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
You let off with talking about the control room. I think
we
would be remiss if we didn't mention that Dyatlov is this embodiment of every bad manager or failing upwards person that you could ever have. I think, he has a military history of being around nuclear reactors. So he's rather flippant and careless with, radiation sickness and all of that stuff. Yeah, it has, we can't leave here without mentioning that, how bad of a failure it is to not, row the same boat with everyone else and to push out something like this bad and this late, this test.
Yeah, and that's one of the great focuses of this series as a whole. Once we get into some of the other episodes, is we kind of get a little bit more as to why and like how vile Dyatlov really is. Because in the beginning, we really get Jared Harris's character, Legasov's blame more than anything else. We just get like the blame placed on him, and then we kind of see it unfold, and it's like, dude, you're being ignorant. You're being an idiot. Why are you being an idiot? Why are you ignoring the truth? And we like don't have the why yet. And that's kind of exciting as a premise, too. Very different than what a number of conventional series would do, which is start at the beginning and unwind. We're starting at the accident and unwinding in both directions at the same time.
Yeah, obviously there's the Chernobyl Commission or whatever it would be called. But it's interesting that this has vibes of a investigation or mystery, which fits into a lot of the thriller vibes you get from all the intense moments.
Yeah. Dyatlov is obviously delegating everything and ignoring any of the feedback.
Like any good manager.
Yeah, exactly. And he's sending people to go figure out what's happening, to go look at the core, to go make sure things are going right.
Oh my God.
And it completely ignoring that their face is all fucked up and sunburnt and just burnt. Like, it's not sunburn, it's just radiation burns.
I believe the type of radiation we're looking at here when you see such fast, rapid burns would be beta radiation burns. There's a specific word for it, but it comes from beta rays. Beta radiation, excuse me.
The scenes through the hallways, it's dark and just drab and dreary and horrifying to see the people like sluggishly moving through, vomiting, passing out, bleeding, burning. Like it is absolutely incredibly horrifying.
It's very horrifying, very visceral. This is just again, I'm not going to try to split hairs on this because I get some of the sacrifices that are made for narrative decisions. The one guy that holds open the door, he just like mysteriously starts bleeding, and that has always bothered me. The guy that's holding the door open, he starts like developing blood spots. Now, while beta radiation, with the graphite, that's a very real, plausible type of situation that you see with the firefighter. But that guy just like seems to like suddenly combust into bleeding, which I don't think any form of radiation exposure is going to do to you. But maybe he had a circumstantial cut or something like that. Now it's being exposed from the conventional explosion. But
so I always thought it was the spots that he was leaning on the metal were like the ones where he got the bleeding.
But
so it was where he touched the metal.
How are you going to get bleeding from that?
Plus the
he like
it's not plus
it's
the
very
radiation.
It's really quick, but he
that
touches one of the metal door frames, and he seems to react like it's hot. So I watched this a bunch of times. I was trying to figure it out. Like I kept rewinding and watching it, and I couldn't. All I could really tell is maybe it was like hot and like burning his skin somehow. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me either, but that did stick with me a little bit.
That's where when I see like the people that are like directly looking at the core or the vomiting, those are things real. There's actually a calculus you can do for like since moment of radiation exposure to time of vomiting. You can actually use that to determine the dosage roughly. But there are some problems that I have, which is like that guy just like suddenly bleeding. It's purely a narrative choice and is somewhat deceptive to the actual circumstances, unless you could explain it with like he had a cut or the door's hot enough that it's going to make him bleed. But I don't think either of those are the case. I think it was purely a narrative choice and not a scientific one. But whatever. I'm splitting hairs. But it is a good hallway scene. It's really good. Just a couple small things.
I'd be, if we weren't actively recording right now, I'd look it up and see if there's any like scientific reason for that to be happening, but I haven't. So I don't know. Yeah. That I literally earlier today was like rewinding and trying to rewatch it and figure out what was happening. And all I could tell was it had something to do with him like touching and reacting to the door frame, which isn't even what he was leaning against. So I don't know.
Yeah,
but
fair. I looked at a decent amount of science like a year and a half ago, so I'm going to be wrong in some of my explanations. But maybe this is actually a good point to do this really quickly. So typically you see three types of radiation surrounding like this type of exposure. So there's three types of radiation primarily, alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha radiation it's basically like helium atoms. And given the way they work, you don't need a lot of shielding. So this is why like your skin is, enough to shield you from it, or dead skin, I should say. Your skin would actually like, absorb it if it made direct contact. But we don't really have concern about it because you're naturally going to have like film over your body, which is kind of gross. You can basically stop alpha particles with a sheet of paper. Beta radiation is more like what you see from like sun exposure, and that's what it's going to cause the burns people see on their body so quickly. It's the one that is probably the least, or it's of the three, it's probably the least dangerous, which I got to put an asterisk on that. But that's what's going to see the sunburn type of effect. And what that one comes from is it's mostly it's not mostly, it's a neutron particle. Gamma radiation is photons. So that one is, the worst in aggregate and hardest to block because, photon can basically pass through almost anything. And I neglected to mention this on beta radiation. You need, lead shielding is fine. Concrete is fine. Wearing a shirt is moderately okay. But if you go just purely by the particle, alpha is actually the worst, because if it is able to, like, you ingested something that contained alpha radiation or was emitting those particles, if it's inside your body and there's nothing to shield you, that's just going to bounce around and wreak havoc. But most of the type of exposure we're seeing and causing problems to people in this episode is beta radiation. Hopefully someone corrects me if I said anything wrong.
The big problem with there, again, is like the dose, distance, hour, time that kind of Legasov gets into, I think, a little bit in the next episode, and explains why, like, even 3.6 Rontgen isn't a good thing, provided, kind of the rate, the hourly rate, and the damage that can do. So we're just amplifying it as we approach the source, correct? Obviously, and that's why this is so dangerous.
Yes. There's also problems with how the show kind of represents radiation exposure and dosage. But yeah, we'll probably talk about that in episode 2.
Yeah, that's super interesting stuff. And thank you for breaking that down. Outside of the facility, the council and the bureaucrats and the leaders, the directors of the facility, all kind of meeting. We get the two main ones that we follow a little bit. I can't keep most of the names straight in the show. Brickinoff? Yeah. Con O'Neill plays him. And Nikolai Fomin. That's it. Okay.
Cross, can you say Kwisatz Haderach for me?
Kwisatz Haderach. Yeah.
But this is where we really start to see the way the bureaucracy works in this situation, where it is chain by chain of, he told me this, so this is what it is. So I can tell this person, they can tell this person, and eventually it'll get all the way to the top. And because I am just part of the chain, it's not my fault. God, it's so frustrating, man. There's no checks or balance to anything.
Yeah, the continuing theme with Dyatlov when Viktor Brakhanov mentions, how could this be my fault? I was in bed. It's, as any manager should do, it is to, support and provide your, subordinates is a bad word to use, but your subordinates to be able to be self-sufficient. And it has to stop at an executive somewhere, right? Like, if there is a problem like this, it's a systemic problem, and you are the one who created the system. So I don't know how it's not your fault. So when you hear that, it just makes you want to scream.
But what's even worse is they do kind of have that check in place, and that's the council, and they're met with adversity and like, no, we already determined that this is the truth. So what the fuck are you guys doing here? Again, episode 2. This is why I broke this into episodes, so we can try to keep it a little bit more focused.
Well, so
the meeting, isn't that in episode 1?
It is in episode 1. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it is.
I meant the meeting with Legasov. Like I'm talking about
when Legasov. Yeah, that's not until. Yep.
Yeah, that's the central committee. But this local district committee, what you're talking about specifically is Aemon Targaryen. I don't actually know what the guy's name is, but or wait, no, is it Aemon Targaryen? No,
I think it's Aemon, isn't it?
No, it's the sorry, this is bad tangent. It's the House Stark. What do they call them?
Yeah, Maester.
Maester Lewin.
Lewin. Yeah. Llewellyn, whatever, however that's said.
This is actually like a strangely powerful and inspiring moment for me, but it is kind of neat when the guy says, like, okay, this is the Vladimir I. Lenin power station. What we do here now, this is our moment. And like, while, yes, that's awful, it's bad, I'm very transparent and open in my own personal life. It's interesting to get this Soviet perspective that is just so fundamentally different than how we do things, which is why I say like somewhat inspirational tongue in cheek, right? I don't actually mean that.
Yeah, I totally understand that. It is very interesting. I find that fascination, to go back to what Craig Mazin said on the podcast. He's like, some of these people that were in this room literally were a part of the revolution. And this was an example of one of those people of whom is like pointing to this and being like, we have to believe in the way, and like was instructing them as such. And like, that's so interesting. It'd be like if we had a guy who was inspired by the founding fathers and was like around them talking about them in like a city hall meeting. You'd be like, fuck, I guess.
Well, right. And if you imagine it like this being like a fly on the wall, or looking at this from 1,000-foot perspective, after they kind of make the determination that, okay, cut the phone lines, we're going to kind of go like ghost on this for a little bit. Even the people that raised concerns, that guy who seemed like just a general laborer and not really like somebody in a position of power, they all had to get up and clap. It just feels so like, not cringe is the wrong word, but it feels so strange. But, as I'm saying this thought, I remember that in the 6 years of public school I had, every morning we would get up and sing the Pledge of Allegiance. So I think everyone has a certain level of dogma. So it all probably looks weird depending on how you were raised or where you grew up.
Right.
Yeah. I think the other part that is hard to remember, especially given our knowledge of the situation, is that as far as I can tell, that entire speech and this entire sort of decision to cut the phone lines and seal off the city is entirely void of malice. It's maybe not the most like cool thing to do to people, but in their minds, this is literally for the public's interest. And the biggest threat that they can determine right now is misinformation. And there's a lot of situations that look worse than what they've been told is the reality of the situation. So there's naturally going to be fear, and they're bringing the military police in, so that's going to add more fear. So it's not the way obviously not the way America would handle anything like that. And nobody in America would really go for it, I feel like, for the most part. But it is probably effective and probably the way they're used to doing things. So, but in the moment, all it feels like is malice, and like even the way the shot is framed and the way the speech goes, it seems sinister. And I don't think that's the truth.
That's kind of what I was saying when I brought up like how in a way it's somewhat inspirational. And I think this is where I think, so kind of diving in the kind of unavoidable political discussion is going to somewhat happen in how this series plays out, right? I think that usually things are found best on two extremes, right? So you have like an extreme opposition and an extreme, support of something. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. If we think about how they're trying to handle this by, limiting disinformation, locking things down versus completely open, allow people to rumor mill and have like mass hysteria, it's kind of interesting that like there is probably a truth to what he's saying, but like we should lie somewhere in the middle. Like shutting things down the way they did is, pretty dang aggressive. Don't know if something like that would happen here, but you could argue that not having any restrictions is equally bad, right? So there's got to be like some middle ground somewhere. And so I guess it's just interesting to be provided with that perspective of how they choose to handle it. It's weird, know, good though, or like interesting perspective.
Yeah, to tie into that just a little bit, what's super interesting is we've obviously all lived through the thing that is 2020 at this point. And we talk about responses, and we think about responses. One of the unique things that Craig says on the show is the USSR was uniquely positioned to actually be able to handle this problem. And obviously that's something that we'll talk about over the series, because individuals were more giving for country and whatnot. And it was kind of that sense of patriotism. And, is that wrong? Is that right? Was kind of the part of the argument of this entire series, kind of like you're saying. But we indirectly face something very similar. And I think it also kind of proved Craig's point on that podcast of like, people in the United States probably wouldn't act they would act most immediately in their interests. Some would react in others' interests, and you kind of see this interesting blend. And I can't help but like especially agree after sort of the last 2 years. It's just so interesting. This almost feels prescient now, in its own way, to how people respond to disasters. Obviously, something localized like this, highly, it's very different, but nonetheless, the politics in here are very interesting.
This viewing was absolutely on my mind.
Written in 2014 too. Like, keep that in mind. Yeah. Like, oh my God.
Yeah, it's I think they talk about that on the podcast as well. Like, this is very relevant then, and in a surprising way after the 2016 elections. Like,
yeah, right.
They talk about that relevance, and that has fuck all to do with like how it relates now.
Yeah, right.
And it's still relevant.
Mm-hmm. A narrative about narrative.
That's a great way to put it. That's exactly what it is.
Thanks. I'm pretty sure Craig said that somewhere in one of the podcast episodes, and I'm just miming it, but not in one of the Chernobyl episodes. I think it's in a script notes episode. It was like, I wrote a narrative about narrative. How fucked is that? It was just, anyway. Yeah.
The other thing to remember, though, and I had not a hard time remembering it, but I kept having to remind myself that like this happens in a time when phone lines and walking somewhere or driving somewhere are the only ways to get information to other people outside of the city. So cutting the phone lines and sealing off any exit points, probably pretty effective in cutting anything off information-wise.
Well, and there's another component here too that I was going to save for episode 2 when we talk about the evacuation of Pripyat. There's also something really smart here about this shelter in place that they're imposing on everyone that I don't think they're really trying to do, because they're more concerned about limiting exposure of information. But when you are in like the situation they're in, where it's not like radioactive fallout from like a nuclear bomb, it's different, but there is radiation contamination being spread like all over Pripyat right now. If you just allowed people, if you were honest and you said, here's what happened, and let people do whatever they wanted, they would hop in their Lada and go drive to Kyiv. And if they do that, they just brought an irradiated vehicle, or I should say a vehicle contaminated with irradiated or fissile material. You just brought that to Kyiv, and now that's spreading all over the place. When you force them to shelter in place, this isn't what they were really going for, but it really limited the exclusion zone and exposure to radioactive materials. So it's has an interesting side effect that I don't think they planned for. Like, versus if you were in the Monticello area and you knew that something was going wrong with the Monticello nuclear plant, which is a nuclear plant in Minnesota for non-residents, people be driving all over the place. Like, this is America. It's about freedom. And now you just brought, radioactive materials all over Minnesota.
Yeah. Like, imagine what would happen if this happened at the Monticello plant. Like, how would this go down? Well, this would be so much more fucked.
It would be, but it wouldn't happen there. But it's fine.
Yeah, different type of reactor later. In general, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But, I mean, the point still stands. If a large amount of nuclear radiation were to happen in any really any U.S. city, things would go fucking bonkers compared to how this is handled from a public standpoint. But to your point about the cars and anything exposed to radiation traveling around, this is something we'll probably get into in episode 3, which is, I think that's the one. That's the real heavy, like the dog one.
The impacts.
Right? That's episode 3, or is that 4?
I think it's 3. I feel like it's 3. Maybe it's 4. I think the cold open with 4. Yeah. Is the dog.
Is it 4?
Yeah. Ugh.
Like all just the
cruise.
Having to literally hunt any sort of wildlife within the area in order to stop them from spreading radiation through just walking around, which is horrifying.
To your point, though, Tim, great call. Hadn't even considered that. There's some other nuggets that kind of get dropped in the podcast relating to episode 2, which we can definitely talk about when we get there. But yeah, Totally.
Yeah.
Agreed. Like the car thing, very big problem.
Well,
Could have been.
I think, trying to keep this one focused on the explosion itself and, the referential to things happening in the US, maybe we'll talk more about this in episode 5, but I'll ask this question now. How many deaths in the US have been caused by nuclear reactor explosions?
No explosions. There's only been a meltdown. It hasn't.
It
Right?
has.
Oh.
Well, so I don't want to be fast and loose with the explanation of this explosion here, because I'll talk about this probably in episode 2 at the Central Committee talks. But the only real deaths that happened from sort of a type of containment or explosion type of thing in the US happened in 1961 in Idaho, where there was a steam explosion, much like what happened at Chernobyl. But it was a very, early test reactor, not something that is really going to be that concerning in the grand scheme of things. Like so it something like that has happened here, but that was the very first. It was like one of 3 original plants that we had in the US. And very quickly that susses out like some of the problems with our technology and how to make it better. But we've had, that's not even, you would consider 3 Mile Island to be the most significant nuclear incident we've had in the United States. But we have actually had a steam-based explosion at a nuclear facility in the United States. So
And
it's interesting.
what's the figure? What's the figure that you were alluding to of number of deaths from nuclear explosion?
Sorry. It's
nuclear reactor-based explosions.
3 engineers died in the explosion.
Okay.
But, and it was also, to be clear, it was a steam explosion. It wasn't, which is exactly what happened at Chernobyl, but it wasn't directly revolving around the core. It was, somewhere in the feed water system. There's a steam pressure explosion, which killed 3 people.
Which is more like what they were attributing this to until they learned that it was actually the core exploding, right?
Yeah. Splitting hairs again. Sorry, I don't mean to be this person on this podcast, but the core exploded as a result of
be that person.
Okay, the core exploded as a result of a steam explosion. It was not a nuclear explosion. This gets brought up in the Central Committee in the next episode, which is my most egregious problem with this series. But it was a steam explosion, not a nuclear explosion. And so when we talked about this saying this can't happen in the US, it did, but we never let it happen again. So there we go.
Well, I mean, technically neither did they, but it's definitely a little bit different because they don't exist anymore.
Right. At least in the same concept, conceit. I almost said concept. That doesn't make sense. Anyway.
I think we're getting enough into episode 2 territory that I think we can move on to the sort of final scene. We're back in Legasov's apartment and he gets a call or house or whatever. I think it's a townhouse based on when he walked out and but he gets a call from Sharbina basically informing him that he is on this central committee created by Chief Secretary Gorbachev? Is that his title, technically?
Secretary Gorbachev, that's fine.
Yeah.
Committee, I think it's committee secretary or party committee secretary, Communist Party Committee Secretary Gorbachev, something like that.
Yeah, whatever it is. Yeah. But as the expert on RBMK nuclear reactors, which Legasov as a person was not. But anyway, he is brought on as a member of this council. And that's where we leave the episode. So any information or any comments on that or anything else before we move on to episode 2? This is, by the way, we are doing 2 episodes at a time right now. We're recording both, but these will be released 1 week apart. So trying to keep our heads straight as far as what goes into what episode, but that's kind of tough to do. So forgive us. I don't know if people are going to be listening as they if anybody hasn't watched the show before and you're listening, I apologize because we're probably going to bring information in from later in the series, but That's just kind of how our brains work. And that's literally why I broke these apart. But anything else on episode 1?
I think the only thing that I really didn't mention that I wanted to make mention of was the sort of, we kind of made mention of the fact that this has this like horror thriller feel to it, right? This entire episode. It reminds me in a lot of ways of like the Jaws terror of like the thing unseen, and you're kind of waiting to see it, but it's impossible to see. When you view it, it's kind of Lovecraftian in the way that you are already dead. Right, like it's got this interesting horror and mystique to it, right? That it's like this invisible killer, very reminiscent of horror films, and I just love that from a cinematography and like storytelling perspective. Of course, that gets into like some of the things with radiation and the narrative there, and whether or not things are fully portrayed accurately. Sure, but definitely this highlights it as this like invisible threat, this almost imperceivable threat, and that's fascinating. And unique. Like there are very few stories that can be told like this from history.
Anything from you, Tim?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic introduction episode. And like I mentioned, whatever I would have to do, any sacrificial lambs, or I'll find a child too. I want more of this like 1980s period piece type of content. I think something that was a general reflection I had when watching it last night, and I don't mean to diminish from shows like The Pacific or Band of Brothers. In my youth, I think I would look for gripping historical narrative through the lens of a world war. It's super compelling now to see this type of portrayal of an equally significant historical event, but it's not a story of a soldier through war. It's a very systemic analytical approach of a different sort of problem. So I kind of like, it's a plead or a call to action to make more content like this. I would love to see something maybe on like the Challenger disaster in the US, or like something that's like, 1960s to 2000s, something like this, a drama, a telling of a historical narrative that could use a mini-series treatment. That's all.
There are certainly other like historical ideas and things like that, but I wanted to bring something up here kind of as a recommendation maybe at the end. If folks haven't read it, I highly recommend the Wool book series, and it kind of fits into this sort of like brutalist architecture. Tim, I don't recommend you read anything about it because it will almost immediately spoil you, I'm sure. And I'm trying to keep you away from any of that here, but it's becoming a TV series on Apple Plus, and it is at the very least both superficially the same or similar and interesting and fascinating, and like borrows the brutalist, borrows the like early tech narrative and a lot of those things. And while fiction, I think that it will evoke similar feelings.
What is it called?
Wool.
Okay, and as one final note, you just there said brutalist, not brutalist.
I meant.
So I love that you invoke StarCraft in this podcast. Good job.
Always. Can't help it. Yeah, brutalist.
I mean, we have to. Have we had a podcast at all together that hasn't talked about StarCraft? No,
absolutely not.
I mean, how many? I think we've had 2.
Yeah,
just 2.
Also, like all the ones that Tim and I have done, we've definitely talked about StarCraft for at least a 2-minute sequitur. Like, it's always been a problem. Yeah, those are my thoughts. PJ, did you have any final thoughts?
No, I just want to thank you all for being here. Thank my 2 co-hosts. Thank Tim. Thank you for letting this podcast exist. And Andrew for making it sound good and listenable. And we will see you next week when we talk about episode 2 in like an hour. And by an hour, I mean like 5 minutes after I go pee. So,
nice.
All right. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you soon.
Perfect. Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode on Chernobyl. Again, you can join us, patreon.com/words and whiskey. to listen to the rest. The just basic tier will do. That'll get you access to all of the backlog if you want to listen to the Chernobyl episodes. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed Tim's ramblings, musings, and funny bits. Next week, we'll be back with another interesting episode from our back catalog here. I believe we're going to be talking about PJ's favorite movie, Big Trouble in Little China. So hope you enjoy that episode.